Hello and welcome to the Actual Magicians. Yes, I am an Actual Magicians bookshelf, where today I'm continuing my Tarot Top 100, and today we are at part 5, where I'm going to be looking at decks 41 to 50, and in this little section I'm going to be taking a look at decks between about 1976 and 2004, so a good period of 30 years, which I'm going to call the 80s decks, or the classic decks, or the late 70s decks, pre-2000 decks. And we're going to start with the Tarot of the Witches by Fergus Hall, published by US Games. And this is a fairly well-known deck because of two reasons. One, it was featured in the James Bond film Live and Let Die. And secondly, it's one of the more detested tarot decks on the market, and part of the reason of that is because of its misnaming. It says Tarot of the Witches, but it has very little to do with witches. Certainly had a lot more to do with voodoo in the James Bond film, so a lot of conflation of things. And there's some interesting stories about this, and this is why it's one of my top 100 decks, because the artist Fergus Hall was better known as the artist who painted some of the Yes covers. I believe it was Yes. And we can see here a surrealistic style that they had. The Lovers here, which I think is one of the cards featured in the James Bond film. And the James Bond film actually had a number of cards that were Waite Smith and a number that are Fergus Hall's depiction. And it's quite interesting because in the published version, you see the backs like so, but there is a version with the 007 on the back of them, and that's the version that's in the film. So they were obviously printed in time for the film to be filmed as it was being produced. And when Jane Seymour, as Solitaire, the tarot card reader, lays out the cards for James Bond, the secret agent, it actually has his code number 007 all across the back of them, which you can see in the film. So she could have actually told him his secret code number as well in the film, License to Kill. So we have the Fool here, and I think it was maybe the Knight of Swords. I think I've got these out for a previous course. The Magician. I think it was the Knight of Swords and the Fool that feature in the film. And one of the interesting things is I can't find them at the moment, but I actually have a collector's item that's composed of 3 of the bits of the Fool card from the actual film, because it features in the film. The prop department for the James Bond franchise actually sell a lot of the props. And what they did with the tarot deck, which is sacrilege, you ask me, is they cut the tarot deck up and it's sold in sort of clear packets like a collectible card game, and you can collect the bits of the original cards. And I'm trying to piece together, I can't remember if it's the Fool or the High Priestess. I think it's the Fool that I'm trying to piece together, and I just have one piece to buy from this middle bit. So if anyone out there has any of the pieces of the Fool, that one piece I think I'm missing, this little bit, then get in touch below. That'll be very useful, thank you. So Fergus Hall actually had an interesting background, and this is another interesting bit of the story, is that he ended up in a Buddhist sanctuary that is just up the road from where I currently live in the Lake District. So Fergus Hall is not too far away from me, and this is his wonderful artwork. And I think it's a shame that it was always sold, and still is, as the Tarot of the Witches, because it gives a misleading expectation. It's more like a Tarot of the Circus or something like that, or the Surrealistic Tarot. So I actually do love the images for this, and I love the artwork. It's proper artwork. But of course, for people who bought it believing that they were going to be a witch by having this tarot deck, very disappointing to find, particularly the fact that it's pip cards as well. So the 8 of Wands there, Ace of Batons as it's called in this deck. King of Cups, I love his expression. Get that in focus. Yeah, so unfortunately the minor arcana are pip cards, and with the same image in the middle, it would have been even nicer if this image would have changed for a more pictorial illustration of the symbology for the cards, but unfortunately it doesn't, as you can see. So we are going to cover a deck that is far more a pagan or witchcraft deck when we come to take a look at the Druidcraft deck in this collection of 10. And there are other pagan and witchcraft decks, particularly a lot more, particularly since between 1970 and 2000, as we're going to take a look at in this set of 10. But here we have the Tarot of the Witches. It was published in 1976 and marketed alongside the film, I believe. So that is Fergus Hall and his wonderful artwork, particularly for the major cards and the court cards. So Temperance here, you can see Temperance. Just find a final court card to end with Tarot of the Witches, which is not a Tarot of the Witches at all. I love the expressions on the faces. So that is in at number 41 of my top 100, and that is Fergus Hall and Tarot of the Witches, published by US Games. Number 42 in my list is the Morgan Greer Tarot, originally published in 1979. Let's see if we can get the focus here. I love the rose on the front. The Morgan Greer, very much of its time, in 1979. And this is an interesting one because in the little booklet that came with it, we still had the ancient Celtic method of divination in the back, which we know is neither ancient nor Celtic nor a ancient method of divination. And it's not really a cross either. So there's a number of issues. I've written a small booklet on the origins of the Celtic cross. It actually comes from a Golden Dawn method, of all things, probably based on some form of cartomantic literature. Now, the Morgan Greer deck was illustrated by Bill Greer under the direction of Lloyd Morgan, and I love the little name thing here. It's illustrated. It gives a quite pastoral view of the tarot, and to me this is almost a semi-more realised version of the Waite-Smith, and that's partly why it was popular. I don't know how popular it still is, what the sales are like. It's published by another US Games, I believe. Yep, US Games, Morgan Greer. And I love this deck. This is about my third version of this deck. I've had at least 3 versions of this, and I've either sold it or given it to somebody. In the case of another similar deck that we're going to take a look at in this 10, the Hanson Roberts, that was a deck that I gave to my son to learn with, the Hanson Roberts, and similarly with the Morgan Greer. It's passed through my hands a lot of times, and you can see the, quite like the 70s moustache on the magician there. You can see how this takes from the Golden Dawn and the Paul Foster Case, I guess, the BOTA teachings. It's a sort of conflation of those two, so it has a slightly Tarot de Marseille style to some of the cards, drawing on the work of Paul Foster Case and the Waite-Smith deck as well. Like the expression on the lion there. And when we come to the minor arcana, we can see, if I just pull some out here, we can see how these are, again, a slightly more scenic, realised view of the Waite-Smith images. I don't know in all cases whether they add or take away or just slightly different artistic rendering of the same design, but your mileage may vary with this as any other deck. And some of these cards do have an Aquarian Tarot, a David Palladini sort of style to them, which I covered in my top 1 to 10 decks, the Aquarian deck. And again, in some cases, I think it really adds to the image. I love the red and white rose there on the different wreaths. But in some cases, I think it doesn't really add too much to the image. But if you don't like this style of the Waite-Smith Tarot, then the Morgan Greer. The Morgan Greer is a deck that you might take a look at. It's been around a long time. Let's say this one is 1979, so it certainly stood the test of time. This one seems to be a far more accurate representation of Persephone waiting for the Kraken and waiting for Perseus to come and rescue her than perhaps the Waite-Smith, which looks a bit more abstracted from that myth or from that story. A more fiery sort of 3 of Wands. We don't really have the coast there, the watery elements of it, so it's a more fiery to do with the 3. Same with the 4, which dispenses with the figures inviting you, so it's just more of an open invitation, and so forth. So again, the Morgan Greer is a great deck, and particularly parallel or an adjunct to the Waite-Smith type of deck, and that is number 42 in my list of a top 100. And again, we're sort of going through thematically, and in this set of the 10 decks of sort of mid-80s, 1979, 1976 onwards to 2000, I'm doing these in date order, so they're not in an order of being a favourite or anything, or in order of use, because I circulate around a lot of these, and a lot of these I haven't necessarily used for about 20 years or so. Some of them I have, but these are all date ordered within this sequence as well. So we went from 1976 and we're now in 1979 for the Morgan Greer Tarot as deck 42. And deck 43 is the first of our round decks, the Motherpeace Round Tarot deck by Karen Vogel and Vicky Noble. You can see that I've used this one an awful lot. It's just literally falling to pieces. There is another later version of this, which again has been with me quite a while, has seen some action. So this comes with a book that's built into the box and comes with a slightly smaller version of the deck. So you can see from the box, around the right way there, the box set there, and the original deck is far bigger than current version. But I love this deck. This is a classic 1981. It was started in 1978. Again, a US Games deck. A lot of the decks around this time are US Games, who were the major producer of tarot. And now we have our first round deck. So the Shaman of Swords. And now we see quite a big departure in the sort of late 70s into the 80s, a more feminist-leaning deck, a more culturally diverse deck. Infused with the late 60s, mid 70s vibe. And some people, again, will respond to this, I guess, more simplistic style of imagery. Other people just won't like it at all. It reminds me a little bit that nowadays a lot of people know, perhaps when they think of a deck like this, they may not think of the Motherpeace, which is a sort of classic of its times, but perhaps the Gaian Tarot by Joanna Powell Colbert, perhaps. Quite like the Devil here. Again, the range of mythic images that are drawn on in this deck are very, very wide-ranging, very global. And then we come to the minor arcana. This is very good for festivals and fields, which is where I think I've used it more often than not in outdoor events. It just has that vibe to it, the 5 of Pentacles or 5 of Discs there. And some people find it difficult to shuffle or lay out circular cards. I love it because I've got huge hands, so it's very easy to shuffle. And then I like to lay them out in a sort of circular pattern, and then you really get the colours popping as well. If you can just see the colours there. Notice that we've got Nuit that we see on the Thoth Tarot, here on the Chariot Tarot, which has got an ancient Egyptian theme to it. So again, the colours really pop out of this one. You can see just glancing at the images. You just get this wonderful pink version, pink card there. Nice, soft, gentle imagery of the Fool. You can see all of the different symbology packed into that. We have both the cat and the Papus crocodile here. Some mushrooms take at your peril. Some yoga going on. Again, very infused with the 70s and 80s. I think it was started to be developed around the late 70s, 1978. And I think it's even been shown on a fashion designer's dresses recently. Some of the designs were featured as a homage back and a recognition of the influence of the Motherpeace Tarot in tarot development and in artistic development as well. It really broke open the, I guess, Waite-Smith Thoth derived decks and showed that you could do something very different with a deck. There's the High Priestess. And I was just reminded, actually, that this deck is very similar to the Shining Tribe deck, Rachel Pollack's, the late Rachel Pollack's deck, and her artwork and design is very along this ethos as well. And I'm sure she would have recognised and talked about the debt owed to all of us by the Motherpeace falling to pieces round tarot. And that's number 43 in our sequence. At number 44, and taking us to 1985, is the Hanson Roberts Tarot, illustrated by Mary Hanson Roberts, and like several of these decks around this period, published by US Games. And this is a deck that has been in and out of my hands so many times I've lost track. I think this is probably my 4th or 5th version of it. The 3rd version at least, or the 3rd purchase version of this that I had, was given to my son to learn tarot with when he was quite young. And I love the fairy tale romance of this, the To All Believers. And again, we see this wonderful pictorial designed Name card by Mary Hanson Roberts. And this deck is ideal for kids. I think it's fairly safe for kids. I think there might be one or two cards in here that perhaps might take under advice, but I seem to recall that most of the images in this are child-friendly. The Lovers is one where we sometimes look like the Lovers and the Devil and Death to see how they will go over with kids. But the Lovers there is very young and romantic. Just find Death. Death is a nice depiction. The figures look as if they're sleeping more than anything in this. Depends on whether you have a fear of skeletal figures in the night or not. And I love the background that's been drawn into these. It's really interesting that it gives it a bit more depth than the Waite-Smith deck, which tends to be quite flat as far as the perspective goes, which is perhaps a choice. The Sun here. And if you take a look at the Sun, it's a bit like the Teletubbies, I guess. Which again may be wonderful and calming if you're a child, but deeply, deeply terrifying if you're an adult, depending on how you respond to this particular style of artwork. Some people find this deck a little bit twee, but I love it, and it's got some classic images that have been used time and time again from this particular deck. Again, it's very Waite-Smith. A lot of decks were obviously produced based on the Waite-Smith imagery. There were very few decks to break out of that mould, and a lot of the decks weren't really following the Thoth, other than perhaps some of the slightly more occult or esoteric decks in the 80s. The Hanson Roberts was very, very popular and probably still is deck. This was my son's favourite court card there. Very motherly Queen of Pentacles. Yeah, so I think this deck really has the style of the Waite-Smith. It doesn't really go too far from that, but it's a more pastoral and friendly sort of place, I guess, more welcoming sort of place. And depending on your response to the particular artwork, again, you could find it a little bit twee, overly romanticised, or really beautiful and lovely, very comforting. But that's the Hanson Roberts deck, 1985, and that is number 44. So I would have been about 20 and probably bought this deck when it first came out then. Would imagine that I probably did. And as I say, this version, I've had at least 4 versions of this pass through my hands over the years. Sometimes I've given it to people on a workshop. Sometimes I've lost it. Sometimes, very rarely, have I lost a tarot deck. But I'm sure I must have lost at least one Hanson Roberts in my time. So that's deck 44, the Hanson Roberts Tarot. And 1 year after the Hanson Roberts, in 1986, we have deck number 45, which is the Arcus Arcanum Tarot in 1986. Again, I've used this one a little bit to death because this was one of my favourite reading decks in my mid-20s. And it was produced by Hans-Rudi Vascher and Gunther Hager. And I always found this deck to have a lot of oomph to it. And I don't think it's often in many people's lists or referenced a lot, but I really found that this deck, for me at the time, my sort of mid-20s, had a lot of oomph to it. It's a sort of European design, a perhaps medieval style design, the 8 of Wands here. perhaps a comic book style in some of the court cards as well. Ace of Discs, very bullish. You see the hand coming out from the ground, formed of roots and earth. So for me, this was a very, I guess, it felt a somehow masculine deck compared to some of the, perhaps what I felt at the time were more feminine leaning decks. And this one for me had a lot of oomph to it. Again, it sort of has the general thematic ideas of the Waite-Smith, but it really takes it to a different level. It's a Love the Magician. Again, you could imagine this almost on the cover of a graphic novel or a comic book. But it has the Alpha Omega, the infinity sign. So the symbolism is quite smart in it as well. Now, I think this particular deck, the Arcus Arcanum Tarot, is way out of print. It was an A.G. Mueller one, a European one. I don't know if US Games published it and A.G. Mueller distributed it. It looks like this was purely A.G. Mueller, so it is quite hard to get hold of now, I think. So I do apologise if you've been intrigued by the images and go looking for it. But if you do find a copy of it for something that you might want to budget for, then it's definitely a really interesting deck. And that's why it's number 45, which is the number of Adam, ADM in Kabbalah. I don't know why that comes to mind with this deck, but it somehow seems fitting. It's deck number 45. There's the 10 of Cups. Again, there's a lot more drama in this deck, I think. There's a lot more activity. It's as if we're catching all of the characters and the energies of the cards mid-flow. Perhaps that's why it's got a bit more oomph than the very staged Waite-Smith images. This almost brings them a little bit to life. So that's the Arcus Arcanum Tarot number 45, and now we're in 1986. Also in 1986 we have deck number 46, which is the Mythic Tarot. The Mythic Tarot by Juliet Sharman-Berg and Liz Green, illustrated by Tricia Newell. And you have to be careful with this deck because this is one of the rare decks that has been reproduced but with different artwork. So there is a Mythic Tarot out, but it is not the same Mythic Tarot as this one. Even though it still has the same design, the art style and art direction is very different. And I don't like the new version, I have to say. I gave it a go, I guess, but this deck in particular is really, really good for astrological correspondences. It does away with some of the Golden Dawn almost forced correspondences and really is one of the first decks, this is as early as 1986, to really feature astrology strongly in the design of the deck rather than just as a correspondence. So the Mythic deck itself, and this is a deck that a friend of ours, Lady Lynn, we call her Lady Lynn because my other friend Lynn Birkbeck is Guy Lynn, astrologer Lynn, a guy, and the other Lynn, Lady Lynn, we had to call Lady Lynn to make a difference between Guy Lynn, who's just Lynn. So there's Lynn and Lady Lynn reads exclusively with the Mythic Tarot. I think she always reads with the Mythic Tarot, and her deck was well beaten. This version of the deck is quite new, but her deck was really, really beat up. And she bought another version, another deck, same deck, the Mythic deck, while it was still the same artwork, and couldn't use it, had to go back to her beat-up version of the deck, even though the cards were all falling to pieces and so on. So each of these cards has a mythic, Greek myth origin. And so to some extent, we have to know the myths a little bit in order to, this is Persephone, heading down into the underworld. The magician here, Caduceus wand. And again, this takes the Waite-Smith ideas, but it turns them through the lens of Greek mythology. And the court cards in this are purely astrological, and it's the best way, if you have a good astrological background, to really bring the astrology into your readings, even though it has the slight overhead of having to know the Greek myths that are pictured in each of the cards. And again, your mileage may vary with this deck, because there's the art with Tricia Newell, the original Mythic Tarot, and the later Mythic Tarot had totally different art direction. And we'll come on to that when we talk briefly about the Druidcraft Tarot. Not that that had different art direction, but it reminds me of another deck that did, and we'll come on to that with the Druidcraft Tarot at position number 50, I think. But again, as I say, the Mythic Tarot is very much the sort of tarot. It's the Golden Fleece. If you're into Greek myth, the centaur at the back here. And the accompanying work with this, the booklet with it, is brilliant as well. And Liz Green, a very well-known astrologer, so it really does bring the sort of astrology into the tarot. So this is very much at position number, a very strong position, candidate number 46, even though we're just arranging these in date order at the moment. And this was in 1986 when this came out. Okay, we now come into 1990, and we have two decks really close together. Deck number 47, the Connolly Tarot deck, produced by US Games. And then we're going to come to deck number 48, the Jill Tarot, also a US Games. I think US Games featured very strongly in my collection, particularly over this time as well. And with this one, number 47 in my list, the Connolly Tarot, is very similar to some of the others in that it's very Waite-Smith designed, although this one is particularly useful as it says, a gateway to meditation. And again, it uses a Waite-Smith design as its jumping off point, but it is not beholden to it. So it does give your mind a few little different avenues in order to go exploring as you particularly use this deck, which I used for path working quite a bit back in the day. White and red rose there. It's amazing how you come to see different symbols each time you look at a deck, particularly if you've not looked at it for quite a while. You notice certain aspects of the design that may or may not have been apparent to you the first time round. Like the feather of truth here, the feather of Mart, ancient Egyptian goddess of justice. The white rose again featuring on the Three of Swords, cloud running across it. Again, it sort of varies in its depictions, in its illustrative nature. Some cards are slightly clearer than others in terms of the design. And this is very much one of those love it or hate it sort of decks for me. It was a love. This was a deck I found quite difficult to get in with. I didn't think I would get used to it somehow. It was created by Eileen Connolly and illustrated by Peter Paul Connolly. So a Eiley husband and wife team there. Again, published by US Games. I believe the little white book in this also has the standard Celtic cross at the back. It's highly likely. Yep. Here, by now it's become just the Celtic cross spread rather than the ancient Celtic cross spread. It's no wonder that spread has received wide use and critique, because it was in every single little white book. This particular version, I don't know if the original versions of it or the later versions are as glossy as this one, but this is a very particularly glossy deck. I found that really good for meditation work, for visualization and so forth. And some of these characters really struck me at the time as being very narratively rich, like they had their own stories. there seems to be, again, a lot more movement in this deck as opposed to the Smith, which I've always found, even after 40 years of use, a very static sort of deck. So that is deck number 47. Again, we're now into 1990 with the Connolly Tarot deck. A very love it or hate it Marmite sort of deck for me. I didn't like it to begin with, but then I started using it, particularly for meditation, and found it a doddle to really get into. And I don't know why, because I don't particularly like the imagery, don't particularly respond to the artwork, but it just seemed to trigger something in my own head for meditation type work, for path working, and so forth. So I found it very useful for that. Sometimes a deck can really surprise you as to, even if you have a neutral or negative response to it, you might find it actually very useful for a particular sort of reading, a particular sort of ritual use, magical use, dream work, and so on. So don't give up on a deck, and it won't give up on you. That's what I'd say. So that's deck number 47, the Connolly deck from 1990, and now we're going to look at a similar but different 1991 deck. So in 1991, at position number 48, we have the Gil or Jill tarot deck. I'll say Jill because that's the way I've always said it. Could be Gil, but it could be Jill. And this deck I love because, not necessarily because of the artwork, but because of the design. In this deck, the numerology takes front and center. So as we saw with the Mythic deck, we have a deck there that's very good for astrological correspondences. And we've seen decks that are very good for color correspondences. We'll look at some of those when we look at the Golden Dawn decks that I want to recommend, particularly the Golden Dawn Temple Tarot deck, which is very, very specific with color. But this deck, the Jill Tarot from 1991, is good for the numbers. Look how the number itself, the 10, has been put into this. And the keywords are great on this as well. Whether you like, if you don't like keywords or borders, then this is not what this deck is going to require some work from you. But as you'll see from the back, the correspondences are very strong in this. And one of my favorite cards in this deck, one of my all-time favorite cards, because it looks like the original cover for book 4 by Aleister Crowley, where the number 4 was given that sort of treatment as a design. So that is the 4 of Wands, completion. Number 10, desolation. I like the fact that there's a cityscape behind this in shadow. We get the sense that this is not moving towards it like the guy carrying the 10 of Wands, but in the Smith deck, but this is somehow left remaining, like the one is sort of shattered, like desolation. So this is the Jill Tarot by Elizabeth Josephine Jill, or Gill, and we can see that it takes a lot of these keywords from the Thoth deck, which in turn takes it from the Golden Dawn Book T meanings of the cards. Prince of Swords is just action. The Three of Swords, sorrow, the Lord of Sorrow in the Golden Dawn. You can see how the numbers are just intrinsically written into these. Not as elegant, I guess, as the original Thoth Tarot by Frida Harris and Aleister Crowley, but a really clear reading deck. It's a very good deck to get your readings done with. Obviously use this for reversals in the past as well. Prince of Discs, construction. Growth, the Princess, and so forth. So this is the Jill Tarot. It's got, again, a lot. Interestingly enough, Adam McLean, in his tarot collection, which was one of the largest tarot collections in the world, he often judged a deck or pictured a deck by the Fool and the Blasted Tower. And he said that was because the Fool showed how the person designing the deck or the artist had a vision of the Fool, freedom, spirit, where it's more free to do something, whereas the Blasted Tower is far more limited as to what you can do with it. So you can tell a lot about a deck, he said, by the Fall and the Blasted Tower. And I think you can tell everything you need to know about this deck by the Fall. I just love the fact he seems even floating above. And then that dog is a very special sort of dog. It's what we might say is a little bit extra in terms of its doggishness. So that's the Jill Tarot deck number 48 from 1991. So we've gone from, the late 70s into the early 90s. I suddenly realised as I was recording all of these that this particular sequence is over 30 years between 1970, or the late 70s, I guess, 20 years into 2000, and that doesn't seem so long ago that I was reading with all of these particular decks. So that's the Jill Tarot deck number 48 in 1991. Now, as we enter the year 2000, we come to 2001 and the publication of the Romani Tarot by Raymond Buckland, also known for his pagan works, his books, with art by Lisanne Lake. And this is number 49 in my sequence. And as we started with the Witch's Tarot that is not a Witch's Tarot, here we have a Romani Tarot. And it sort of, I guess, when we consider all of the negative tropes that existed about gypsies and the false correspondence between tarot cards and gypsies, particularly prevalent in the early 1900s to the mid-1900s, the Romani Tarot is a very refreshing take on that whole culture. And so we also are going to take a look at the Druidcraft Tarot in 2004 in our set of 10 here. And I guess we're sort of seeing now by 2000 a slight sea change in the way that pagan, neo-pagan, Wicca, witchcraft, all of that entire broad spectrum of movements, belief systems, religious practice, spiritual practice, magical practice, and so forth, are being contextualized and illustrated in tarot. And here we have the Ten of Shivs, where this guy has been well and truly shivved, and the policeman doesn't look particularly that bothered about it, or maybe he does. It's really hard to tell. Maybe the policeman actually did it. It's got a very cheeky sense of humour, this particular deck. You can tell by the card jumping out there. But it's a really interesting deck, and I can't say that I've used this a lot. When I have used it, I've used it for some of our pathworking type things, or I've used it for storytelling, creative work, and for some of our gated spreads. I've used this a few times, but I've never used it as a reading deck at all. Maybe once or twice. This is the Hanged Man, or the Hanged Rabbit. Ace of Shivs. Quite like the storytelling going on in here. There's a leaf left pinned to the trunk, and the caravan is moving on. Ten of Koshas. So there is quite a playful style to this deck, which I really love, and it was quite rare for a while. I don't know if it's been reprinted, but it was certainly quite hard to get hold of for a while. And of course it fits in with Raymond Buckland's background and interests and studies and so forth. So it's a genuine attempt to really capture the Romani tradition within a tarot deck, rather than very lazily and stereotypically conflating it with all sorts of travellers and so forth. And that is the Romani Tarot, deck number 49, and we're now in 2001. So as we started the sequence with the very misnamed Witch's Tarot, we now come to the very accurately named Druidcraft Tarot. So we're now in 2004, so we've gone from the late 70s, early 80s into 2004, and now we have people like Stuart Carr-Gom and the Druidcraft Tarot. And this was a very evocative deck for a lot of people because it really embodies the Arthurian, Druid, Celtic, pagan movements, and really tries to capture those in very inspiring images. Love the moon there. Very naturalistic images as well. And I believe the artist was Will Worthington for this deck. I'll correct that below if I'm totally wrong with that. But now we have a deck that is pagan, a sort of proper pagan deck and a very popular pagan deck for pagans of all persuasions, whether they be druids or heathens or Dianic witches, whatever persuasion of neo-pagan, witch, Wiccan you might be. This is a deck that really speaks to nature, speaks of nature. Two of Pentacles, that card. The artwork is gorgeous. I always love that King of Swords. I don't know what he's thinking, but he's really thinking it. And so, generally speaking, I usually read for pagan events with this particular deck. I've read with this deck at Witchfest in the UK and a couple of other places as well. But this is the deck I'll sort of use. Very druid crafty. Not to be confused with the Robin Wood deck. This is the Druidcraft deck, or the Greenwood deck, or the Wildwood deck, which are all totally different decks. Ace of Swords. See the Cauldron here, 14 instead of Temperance. So some renaming going on with just a few of the cards here. Again, it's very hard to not do the Blasted Tower when you're talking about the Blasted Tower, which I guess is what Adam McLean was talking about. I've always loved that Ten of Swords because it looks like he's given a good fight before he's ended up in that position. So that is deck 50 of my top 100, and I've already sorted out the other 50 decks. We're going to take a look at some magical decks. We're going to take a look at some art decks. We're going to take a look at some Golden Dawn decks, and we're going to take a look at some contemporary decks as well, which I think will be about 30 of the remaining 50, and that will bring us up to the here and now, although I have put some modern decks in my first top 10 because I like some of the modern decks. Now, if there's any particular deck that we've looked at that you'd like me to cover in more detail, I'm really happy to do a table top down, look at the deck, look at using it, look at some of the symbolism within the deck. I can tell you how I've found the deck in terms of readings or things that have been inspired by that particular deck in terms of magical practice and so forth, because I love a deck to actually inspire me to create something out of it, to create something, to speak to it, to honour it the way it wants to be heard. And sometimes that's through a particular ritual practice, sometimes it's through a particular form of consecration or dream work or sigil work or creative work, even a gated spread over many days, and allowing the deck to create its own way of speaking through its own spreads. I find that a very useful way of working. instead of doing a spread for the deck, it's far better to talk to the deck and get it to show you the spreads that it is best suited for. So I'm really happy to talk about any of those if I can from my experience. And until next time, I bid you farewell.